Yuval Noah Harari. 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Talks at Google. Have you ever had the experience of asking yourself a question so large that the asking of it immediately revealed the inadequacy of every framework you had available for answering it? Not a question about your personal life, not a question about your career or your relationships or the specific decisions you are currently navigating, but a question about the entire human project, about the direction in which civilization is moving and whether the direction is one that deserves the confidence and the investment and the collective human energy that is currently being poured into it. A question that, once genuinely asked rather than glanced at and set aside for the comfort of more manageable concerns, refuses to stay in the background where questions of that magnitude are most convenient to keep, but insists on pressing itself into the foreground of everything else you are trying to think about and everything else you are trying to do. The question I am talking about is not a new one. It has been asked, in various forms, by every serious thinker who has looked at the conditions of their era with genuine honesty rather than the protective filter of optimism that the culture of progress tends to require of people who want to remain comfortable participants in it. But it is being asked now with a specific urgency and a specific comprehensiveness that distinguishes the current moment from all previous moments in which it has been seriously entertained, because the conditions that make the question urgent are themselves unprecedented in ways that the previous occasions of its asking were not. The question is this: in a world that is changing faster than our ability to understand it, in a world where the frameworks through which previous generations navigated the most fundamental questions of human existence, questions about work and community and identity and meaning and the relationship between individual human lives and the larger human project, are being simultaneously disrupted by forces whose ultimate implications none of us can fully see. What are the most important things that a human being living right now needs to understand in order to navigate this moment with genuine wisdom rather than mere reactive adaptation to circumstances as they arise? This is the question that animates the work I want to discuss with you today. Not as an abstract philosophical exercise, not as an academic inquiry into the intellectual history of the current moment, but as a practical and urgent attempt to identify the specific lessons that the specific conditions of the 21st century most urgently require of the human beings who are going to have to live in it and navigate it, and ultimately determine whether the civilization it is producing is one that can honestly be called an advancement of the human project or something that, measured against the actual experiential conditions of human flourishing, deserves a more uncomfortable assessment. I want to be honest with you at the outset about what I mean by lessons in this context, because the word carries a range of implications that I want to be precise about from the beginning. I do not mean lessons in the sense of conclusions, settled answers to the questions the current moment is raising that can be learned once and applied thereafter with confidence. The conditions of the 21st century are specifically hostile to that kind of lesson, because the pace of change that characterizes this moment means that conclusions drawn from the conditions of a few years ago may already be inadequate to the conditions of today, and conclusions drawn from the conditions of today may be inadequate to the conditions of a few years hence. The lessons I want to discuss are not conclusions. They are orientations, specific ways of holding and engaging with the questions that the current moment raises that are more likely than their alternatives to produce genuine wisdom rather than the sophisticated performance of wisdom that passes for it in most contemporary discourse. And I want to be honest about something else. The 21st century has been underway for a quarter of its duration. We are not at the beginning of it, with the luxury of observing the early signs of the forces that will define it and adjusting our orientations accordingly before those forces have reached their full development. We are in the middle of it, in the specific and in some respects most difficult position of people who can see both the world that preceded the transformation and the early outlines of the world that the transformation is producing, but who are not yet in a position to see what the full development of that world will look like or what it will require. This position, being caught between a past that is too recent to be fully processed and a future that is too uncertain to be confidently anticipated, is itself one of the defining experiential conditions of the current moment, and learning to navigate it with something that resembles wisdom rather than either paralysis or false confidence is itself one of the most important lessons available. The first lesson, and in some respects the one that underlies all the others, is what I want to call the lesson of the narrative. Human beings are, above almost everything else, storytelling creatures. Not in the trivial sense that we enjoy stories as entertainment, though we do, but in the much deeper sense that the primary mechanism through which human beings make sense of their experience, organize their understanding of the world, motivate their actions, and sustain their sense of who they are and why it matters is the construction of narratives. Stories about themselves, stories about their communities, stories about the arc of history and where it is headed and what role their own lives play within it. For most of human history, this narrative-making capacity operated within relatively stable frameworks. The stories that gave individual lives their sense of significance and direction were stories that had been developed over generations, refined by accumulated human experience, tested against the conditions of actual human life across vast spans of time, and embedded in communities and institutions that sustained them against the inevitable individual challenges to their credibility. The religious narratives that placed human lives within cosmic frameworks of purpose and ultimate meaning, the national narratives that embedded individual citizens in stories of collective identity and collective destiny, the ideological narratives that organized political communities around shared visions of the just society and the direction of historical progress. Even the personal narratives of individual self-development and professional achievement that constitute the dominant framework for individual meaning in the modern, secular West were sustained by the relative stability of the economic and social conditions that made them credible as descriptions of the possible and desirable direction of an individual human life. All of these narrative frameworks are currently under simultaneous pressure of a kind and a scale that is historically unprecedented. The religious frameworks that sustained the largest human communities are navigating crises of credibility produced by the encounter with scientific accounts of the world that leave decreasing room for the specific supernatural claims on which those frameworks depend. The national narratives that organized political community in the 20th century are being disrupted by the emergence of genuinely global forces, both technological and economic, that exceed the capacity of national frameworks to contain or govern. The ideological narratives that organize political conflict in the 20th century have largely collapsed, leaving a political landscape in which the dominant mode of political identity is tribal rather than programmatic, organized around who you oppose rather than what you genuinely believe, and the personal narratives of individual self-development and professional achievement that have served as the primary framework for individual meaning in the modern West are being disrupted by the specific economic and technological transformations that are making the specific forms of achievement those narratives promised increasingly unavailable as reliable destinations for the investment of a human lifetime. The lesson that this simultaneous disruption of narrative frameworks is teaching, the first and most fundamental lesson of the 21st century, is one that is simultaneously obvious when stated and extraordinarily difficult to genuinely absorb in a way that changes behavior. It is the lesson that the specific narratives through which we are currently organizing our individual and collective lives are not the same as reality itself, are not inevitable or permanent features of the human condition, are historically specific constructions that were adequate to the conditions that produced them and may not be adequate to the conditions that are replacing those conditions. And that our attachment to those narratives, however understandable and however human, is itself one of the primary obstacles to developing the genuine wisdom that the actual conditions of the 21st century require. The second lesson follows directly from the first, and it is the lesson about intelligence. Not intelligence in the sense of raw cognitive capacity, the ability to process information, solve problems, and generate novel solutions to specific challenges, which is a capacity that artificial systems are demonstrating. With increasing comprehensiveness and increasing speed, the ability to replicate and surpass. Intelligence in the deeper sense of the capacity to ask the right questions, to identify which of the enormous range of problems competing for human attention are the ones that genuinely matter, to distinguish between the urgently important and the merely urgently attention-demanding, and to maintain the specific quality of engagement with genuinely difficult questions that genuine intelligence, as opposed to mere cleverness, actually requires. This distinction between intelligence as raw cognitive capacity and intelligence as wisdom, generating engagement with what genuinely matters, has always been important, but it is acquiring a new and specific urgency in the conditions of the 21st century for a reason that is rarely stated as directly as it deserves to be. The specific cognitive capacities that education systems have historically been designed to develop, the capacities for memorizing and retrieving information, for applying established analytical frameworks to defined problem types, for performing the specific cognitive tasks that professional expertise in most fields has consisted of, are precisely the capacities that artificial intelligence systems are demonstrating the ability to replicate and surpass with increasing comprehensiveness. If intelligence is primarily raw cognitive capacity of this kind, then the 21st century is indeed producing something that exceeds human intelligence, and the implications of that fact for what human beings are for and what makes human cognitive contribution valuable are as disturbing as they initially appear. But if intelligence is primarily the wisdom-generating capacity to identify what genuinely matters, to ask the right questions, to maintain genuine engagement with the full complexity of genuinely difficult problems rather than the simplified versions that existing analytical frameworks are designed to address, then the 21st century is producing not the obsolescence of human intelligence but its most urgent test. Because the questions that the 21st century is raising, questions about the direction of the human project and the conditions of genuine human flourishing and the governance of technologies whose power exceeds our wisdom in deploying them and the construction of frameworks for collective human life that are adequate to conditions that previous frameworks were not designed for, are precisely the questions that require this specifically human form of intelligence that is not reducible to raw cognitive capacity and that cannot be replicated by any system that lacks the specific form of embodied, historically situated, mortality-aware consciousness that constitutes the specifically human perspective on the conditions of existence. The lesson about intelligence in the 21st century is therefore not the lesson that intelligence is becoming obsolete, or that the development of artificial intelligence makes human cognitive contribution irrelevant. It is the lesson that the specific form of human intelligence that genuinely matters, the form that is irreplaceable precisely because it emerges from the specific conditions of embodied, finite, community-embedded human life, needs to be more deliberately cultivated and more consistently exercised than the conditions of the current information environment are designed to encourage. The third lesson is the lesson about work, and it is one of the most practically urgent lessons of the 21st century because it touches most directly the daily lives of the largest number of people and the specific frameworks through which the largest number of people currently organize their sense of purpose and their sense of contribution and their sense of being genuinely necessary to the world they inhabit. Work has been, for the entirety of human civilization, not primarily an economic activity. It has been primarily a meaning-generating activity, the primary mechanism through which most human beings have experienced themselves as genuine contributors to the collective human project, as people whose specific capacities are genuinely needed and genuinely valued by the community of which they are a part. The economic dimension of work, the fact that it provides the material resources required for survival and for participation in the economy of the society one inhabits, is real and important. But it has always been secondary in terms of the psychological and existential function that work performs to the meaning-generating dimension. People who are economically comfortable will still suffer profoundly from the loss of meaningful work, as the research on retirement and on involuntary unemployment consistently demonstrates. People who are economically precarious will still find in work that is genuinely purposeful a form of sustenance that exceeds its economic value. The specific threat that the 21st century poses to work is therefore not primarily an economic threat, though the economic disruption is real and serious. It is primarily an existential threat, a threat to the primary mechanism through which the largest number of human beings have historically generated the felt sense of being genuinely needed and genuinely contributing. And the lesson that this threat is teaching is not that work itself is becoming obsolete, but that the specific understanding of work as primarily the performance of specific cognitive tasks in exchange for economic compensation is becoming obsolete, and that a genuinely adequate response to the crisis of work in the 21st century requires a much more fundamental rethinking of what work is and what it is for than any of the currently dominant frameworks for discussing the future of work are yet providing. The fourth lesson is perhaps the most counterintuitive of the 21st century's most important teachings, and it is the lesson about equality. For the last several centuries, the dominant progressive narrative of human civilization has been organized around the expansion of equality, the gradual extension of the circle of genuine human recognition and genuine human right to encompass more and more of the population that was previously excluded from it, the abolition of slavery, the extension of political franchise, the dismantling of colonial hierarchies, the expansion of economic opportunity across lines of gender and race and class and national origin. These are genuine achievements of human civilization, genuinely important expansions of the circle of human dignity and human recognition, and any honest engagement with the trajectory of the last several centuries has to acknowledge them as such. But the 21st century is introducing a new and deeply disturbing dimension to the question of equality that the progressive narrative was not designed to address, and that it has not yet found an adequate framework for engaging with. The specific technologies of biological engineering and cognitive enhancement and the algorithmic optimization of human capability that are currently in development and early deployment are creating, for the first time in human history, the genuine technical possibility of the biological enhancement of human beings in ways that would create not merely the social and economic inequalities that previous centuries have produced, but genuine biological inequalities, genuine differences in cognitive capacity and physical capability and lifespan and the fundamental conditions of human experience that are not the product of circumstance but of deliberate biological intervention. This is not science fiction. The specific technologies, genetic editing, brain-computer interfaces, pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement, the algorithmic personalization of educational and developmental experience are all either already deployed or at advanced stages of development. And the specific question they are raising, the question of whether the human equality that the progressive narrative has been expanding for several centuries is going to be replaced by a form of biological hierarchy that makes the social hierarchies of previous centuries look relatively modest in comparison, is among the most urgent and most genuinely difficult questions that the 21st century is placing before human civilization. The lesson that this challenge is teaching is not that equality is impossible or that biological enhancement is inherently wrong. It is that the frameworks through which human equality has been understood and defended, frameworks built on the premise of the fundamental biological similarity of all human beings as the foundation for their equal moral and political status, are going to be tested in the 21st century by developments that challenge that premise in ways that those frameworks were not designed to address, and that developing the genuinely adequate response to this challenge is one of the most important intellectual and political tasks of the current moment, one that requires engaging with the specific technical developments rather than either embracing them uncritically or dismissing them as dystopian fantasy. The fifth lesson is the lesson about community, and it is the lesson that I find most personally compelling and most consistently underweighted in the dominant discussions of what the 21st century requires of human beings. The lesson is that genuine community, not the simulated community of digital platforms or the tribal community of shared political or cultural identity, but the specific form of genuine human community that is constituted by mutual knowledge and mutual obligation and the shared experience of the full range of human circumstances over sustained periods of time is not a luxury or a preference or a lifestyle choice. It is a necessity, a specific and irreplaceable condition of genuine human flourishing that cannot be adequately provided by any substitute, however sophisticated, that digital technology or consumer culture or the therapeutic industry has yet produced. We are, at this specific moment in human history, conducting what amounts to a civilization-scale experiment in human life without genuine community, an experiment that the specific forces of the 21st century, the mobility and the individualism and the digital substitution and the economic logic of efficiency and optimization are imposing on the largest number of human beings who have ever lived in conditions of relative material comfort. And the results of this experiment, measured in the specific forms of individual and social pathology that are its most visible products, are not encouraging. The loneliness epidemic, the mental health crisis, the political polarization and tribal fragmentation, the epidemic of addiction and deaths of despair, the crisis of meaning and purpose that we have examined in previous conversations. All of these are, in significant part, the specific products of a civilization that has dissolved the conditions of genuine community more thoroughly and more comprehensively than any previous civilization, and that has discovered, through the very comprehensiveness of this dissolution, that the conditions of genuine community were not optional features of human social life, but structural requirements of human psychological and existential health. The lesson about community in the 21st century is therefore not a nostalgic argument for the recreation of the forms of community that modernization and urbanization and individualism have dissolved, which is neither possible nor fully desirable given the genuine limitations and genuine injustices that many traditional forms of community embodied. It is a practical and urgent argument for the deliberate reconstruction of the conditions of genuine community in forms that are adequate to the actual conditions of 21st century human life, which requires first being honest about what genuine community actually requires and what the specific obstacles to its reconstruction in current conditions actually are. The sixth lesson is the lesson about truth. And it is a lesson that has acquired in the specific information environment of the 21st century a quality of urgency that would have seemed excessive even a decade ago. The lesson is not that truth is difficult to establish, which has always been true, or that powerful interests have always tried to manipulate the information environment for their own purposes, which is also not new. The lesson is that the specific combination of technologies that are defining the information environment of the 21st century, the algorithmic platforms that optimize for emotional engagement rather than accuracy, the generative AI systems that can produce convincing false information at scale and at essentially zero cost, the social media architectures that are specifically designed to fragment the shared informational reality that democratic deliberation requires, is producing an information environment that is specifically hostile to truth in ways that are qualitatively different from the information environments of any previous era. This is not simply the old problem of propaganda in a new technological form. Propaganda, as it operated in the 20th century, required the capture and control of centralized information channels, the newspapers and the radio stations and the television networks through which the majority of people received their information about the world. The specific challenge of the 21st century information environment is precisely that it is not centralized, that it operates through billions of individual information streams that are personalized to the specific psychological profiles of their individual recipients in ways that make the old model of capturing centralized channels not merely inadequate but irrelevant as a description of how the manipulation of shared reality now operates. The lesson about truth in the 21st century is therefore not primarily a lesson about how to identify and counter false information, though that is a genuinely important practical skill. It is a lesson about the conditions under which truth as a shared social resource can be maintained in an information environment that is specifically designed to fragment it, and those conditions which include the existence of shared institutional authorities that are trusted across significant portions of the population, the maintenance of genuine epistemic communities of inquiry that are committed to the correction of error rather than the defense of tribal position, and the cultivation of individual cognitive habits that prioritize accuracy over confirmation are among the most endangered features of the current civilizational landscape. The seventh lesson is the lesson about resilience, and it is the lesson that the 21st century is teaching most directly through the specific quality of the disruptions that are characterizing it. Resilience, in the context of the 21st century, is not primarily the capacity to survive specific shocks and recover to previous states. It is the capacity to adapt to conditions that are genuinely different from previous conditions without losing the specific core of values and commitments and relationships that constitutes what is worth preserving through the adaptation. This distinction matters because the specific disruptions that the 21st century is producing are not the kind that allow recovery to previous states. They are the kind that require genuine adaptation, genuine change in how things are organized, and how individuals and communities and institutions understand their purposes and their possibilities, rather than the temporary crisis management that allows a return to the arrangements that preceded the disruption. The specific forms of resilience that the 21st century most urgently requires are therefore not the forms that previous centuries' disruptions most clearly demanded. They are not primarily the resilience of physical endurance or collective solidarity in the face of external threat, though those forms of resilience remain relevant. They are primarily the resilience of cognitive flexibility, the capacity to genuinely update fundamental beliefs and fundamental frameworks in response to genuine new evidence without losing the specific commitments and the specific values that make the updating worth doing. The resilience of identity stability, the capacity to maintain a coherent sense of who you are and what you stand for through conditions that are genuinely transforming the external circumstances against which that identity was formed. And the resilience of genuine relationship, the specific form of resilience that only genuine human community can provide. The capacity to draw on the sustenance of genuine mutual knowledge and genuine mutual care in conditions where the external frameworks that previously provided orientation are dissolving faster than new ones are available to replace them. The eighth lesson is the lesson about meditation, and I use this word deliberately because it points towards something more specific and more practically important than the generic self-improvement discourse about mindfulness has managed to convey. Meditation, in the sense I want to discuss, is not primarily a stress reduction technique or a productivity enhancement tool, though it may produce those results as secondary effects. It is the specific practice of genuine observation of one's own mind, the deliberate cultivation of the capacity to notice what is actually happening in your own cognitive and emotional experience without immediately reacting to it, without immediately editing it into a more acceptable version, without immediately reaching for the nearest available explanation or the nearest available distraction. This capacity, which every serious philosophical and contemplative tradition in human history has identified as fundamental to genuine wisdom, is under specific and unprecedented assault in the conditions of the 21st century's information environment. The specific architecture of the digital platforms that mediate the majority of conscious experience for most people in most developed societies is specifically designed to prevent this capacity from developing, because the capacity for genuine self-observation is precisely the capacity that would allow people to recognize what the platforms are doing to them and to make genuinely informed choices about their relationship with those platforms. A population with strong capacities for genuine self-observation is a population that is far less susceptible to the specific forms of attention capture and emotional manipulation that the business models of the dominant digital platforms depend on. The lesson about meditation in the 21st century is therefore not the lesson of a self-improvement practice. It is the lesson of a political and epistemic necessity, a specific form of individual cognitive sovereignty that the conditions of the 21st century are making simultaneously more difficult and more essential than at any previous point in human history. The ninth lesson is the lesson about suffering, and it is perhaps the lesson that requires the greatest care in its articulation, because it is the most easily misread as either a form of masochism or a form of resignation that it is not. The lesson is not that suffering is good, or that the reduction of suffering is wrong, or that the genuine and important achievements of modern medicine and public health and social welfare in reducing the scale of preventable human suffering should be reversed or resisted. The lesson is that suffering, specifically the suffering that is irreducible to preventable causes, the suffering that emerges from the fundamental conditions of finite, conscious, vulnerable human existence, has a specific and important function in the human experience that the culture of the 21st century's most developed societies is systematically attempting to eliminate, with consequences for the quality of lived human experience that are not what the eliminators intended. The suffering that emerges from genuine loss, from genuine failure, from genuine confrontation with the limits of one's own capacity and the uncertainty of one's own future and the mortality of oneself and the people one loves, is not simply a negative experience to be minimized. It is, when genuinely engaged with rather than managed and avoided, one of the primary generators of the specific qualities that make human life most genuinely worth living. The depth of genuine empathy, the seriousness of genuine commitment, the specific quality of attention to what genuinely matters that only comes from having genuinely experienced what it costs to lose it. The culture of the 21st century's most developed societies is producing, with increasing efficiency, what might be called the sanitization of suffering, the management of every form of discomfort, every form of difficulty, every form of genuine struggle, with an arsenal of technological and pharmaceutical and cultural interventions that is genuinely impressive in its comprehensiveness and genuinely misguided in its fundamental premise. The premise that the good life is the life with the minimum possible suffering, rather than the life in which the suffering that is genuinely unavoidable is engaged with in ways that allow it to perform the specific functions that it has always performed in genuinely flourishing human lives. The 10th lesson is the lesson about God. And I want to engage with this one with the specific care it deserves, because it is the lesson that is most likely to be misread as either a religious argument or an anti-religious argument, when it is in fact neither. The lesson about God in the 21st century is a lesson about the specific human need that the concept of God, in its most profound philosophical and experiential dimensions, has historically addressed, and about the specific inadequacy of the responses that the secular 21st century has so far produced to that need. The need is not primarily the need for an explanation of the origin of the universe, which the scientific framework has addressed with extraordinary success. It is not primarily the need for a supernatural guarantee of moral behavior, which the philosophical traditions of secular ethics have addressed with more success than the religious critics of secularism typically acknowledge. It is primarily the need for a framework of ultimate significance, for a story about the nature of reality that places human existence within a context that makes it genuinely, irreducibly, unconditionally significant, rather than contingently significant in ways that are dependent on circumstances that could always be otherwise. This is the specific need that the secular 21st century has not yet found an adequate response to. Not because the need is illegitimate or because the only adequate response to it must take a supernatural form, but because the dominant secular frameworks of the 21st century, the frameworks of scientific materialism and liberal individualism and democratic political philosophy, are not primarily frameworks for ultimate significance. They are frameworks for understanding the physical world and for organizing political community and for protecting individual rights, all of which they do with genuine success. But they do not, in their dominant forms, provide what the human need for ultimate significance most fundamentally requires, which is a story about what consciousness itself means, about whether the specific quality of experience from the inside of a finite human life is, in the deepest sense, what the universe is doing, or whether it is simply what the universe happens to be doing in this particular corner of itself for this particular moment of its history. The 11th lesson is the lesson about secular humanism, understood not as a comfortable default position that requires no examination or no intellectual engagement, but as a genuine philosophical commitment that is genuinely demanding in ways that its most comfortable cultural forms consistently understate. Secular humanism, in its most honest and most rigorous form, is the commitment to human flourishing as the ultimate value in the absence of supernatural authority, to the development of the specifically human capacities of reason and empathy and creativity and genuine relationship as the foundation for the good life and the good society. This is a genuinely demanding commitment, demanding in its requirement that the good be genuinely understood and genuinely pursued rather than simply performed, demanding in its requirement that the human capacities it celebrates be genuinely cultivated rather than simply assumed, demanding above all in its requirement that the specific conditions of genuine human flourishing be honestly examined rather than simply equated with the conditions that the dominant economic and political arrangements of the current moment happen to produce. The lesson about secular humanism in the 21st century is therefore not the lesson of its inadequacy as a framework, which it is not. It is the lesson of the gap between its most honest and most rigorous form, and the comfortable, undemanding version of it that most people who would identify as secular humanists are actually practicing, and of the specific intellectual and moral work required to close that gap in conditions that are specifically hostile to the effort. The 12th lesson is the lesson about science, and it is a lesson with two faces that are rarely presented together but that genuinely need to be held together if the lesson is to be genuinely useful. The first face is the obvious one, the extraordinary power and the extraordinary achievement of the scientific method as the most reliable available instrument for generating accurate knowledge about the physical world and the biological and cognitive dimensions of human experience. The second face is less comfortable but equally important, the specific limitations of the scientific method as a framework for addressing the questions that the 21st century is most urgently raising, the questions about value and about meaning and about what constitutes genuine human flourishing and what kind of world is worth building and toward what ends the enormous power that science and technology are generating should be directed. Science is extraordinarily good at telling us what is possible. It is not designed to tell us what is desirable. Science can tell us how to edit genomes, but it cannot tell us which genomes should be edited toward which ends and in accordance with what values. Science can tell us how to design algorithms that maximize engagement, but it cannot tell us whether maximizing engagement is a worthy goal for the informational infrastructure of human civilization. Science can tell us how to extend human lifespan indefinitely, but it cannot tell us whether an indefinitely extended human life would be a genuinely good human life, or whether the finitude it eliminates is itself a constitutive feature of the specific form of significance that makes human life worth living. The lesson about science in the 21st century is therefore not the lesson of its inadequacy, which it is not. It is the lesson of its incompleteness as a guide to the most important decisions the century is placing before human civilization, decisions that require the integration of scientific understanding with the specifically human forms of wisdom about value and meaning and genuine flourishing that no scientific method can generate on its own. The 13th lesson is the lesson about education, and it is perhaps the most directly practical of all the lessons we are discussing, because education is the primary mechanism through which each generation transmits to the next what it has understood about the conditions of human life and the capacities required to navigate them. The specific challenge that the 21st century presents to education is the challenge of transmitting capacities rather than information, in a world where the information that previous educational systems were designed to transmit is increasingly available instantaneously to anyone with a device that connects to the global information network. But where the specific cognitive and emotional and relational capacities required to make genuinely wise use of that information are becoming simultaneously more important and less reliably developed by the systems that are supposed to develop them. What does education need to look like in the 21st century if it is to develop the specific capacities that the 21st century most urgently requires? Not the capacity to memorize and retrieve information, which devices can perform more reliably than human memories. Not the capacity to apply established analytical frameworks to defined problem types, which AI systems are increasingly performing more efficiently than human cognitive processes. But the specifically human capacities, the capacity for genuine self-knowledge and genuine empathy, the capacity for critical engagement with one's own assumptions and the assumptions of the frameworks one inhabits, the capacity for genuine collaboration with people whose perspectives are genuinely different from one's own, the capacity for sustained engagement with genuinely difficult and genuinely unresolved questions without retreating to the comfort of premature resolution. These are the capacities that the 21st century most urgently needs educated human beings to possess, and they are, with disturbing consistency, the capacities that the educational systems of the 21st century's most developed societies are least effectively developing, because they are the capacities that are most difficult to measure with the standardized metrics that accountability-oriented educational systems most readily employ, and therefore the capacities that tend to be crowded out by the preparation for the assessments that those metrics generate. The 14th lesson is the lesson about meaning, which we have examined in detail in previous conversations, but which deserves its place here because it is, in the most fundamental sense, the lesson that all the other lessons are ultimately in service of. The lesson is not that meaning is impossible to find in the 21st century, which is both false and actively harmful as a conclusion. It is that meaning in the 21st century cannot be passive.